to our final reading of the 13th annual Literary Festival, I believe. It's been a good festival and it's been a great turnout, so thank you all for coming. And if you came to multiple events, then we extra thank you, I guess. We're excited to have John Haskell here tonight, and he's going to do a little reading, and he's agreed to take questions after the reading, and he will sign books as well when he's done. So there were books outside over here for sale, a couple novels and a collection of short stories. So please go ahead and grab one and stick around and get it signed. There's a ton of food in the back. Like, there's more cookies than I can eat. So please eat them and get them out of here, so I don't start eating them. There are some drinks and some what are those things? Fruit, thank you. Fruit back there. Before I introduce Dan and Phil, who will do the formal intros tonight, I just need to thank many people. First off, I need to thank Lisa Sewell, Dr. Lisa Sewell, who I teach the Literary Festival course with. Oh, she made it. So I was going to say she was stuck in the horrendous traffic over there, but
I made it.
You made it. So I need to thank Dr. Sewell for being a great co-teacher in the Literary Festival course. I need to thank the class itself. It's been a great class. You guys have been fantastic, really good readers, fantastic question askers, so thank you so much. I need to thank Dr. Evan Radcliffe and all the faculty in the English department. Thank you all, everybody in the English department who has taught the work that the authors have come to read in the class. Has been very helpful. Thank you for all the wonderful support there. I need to thank the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and all our co-sponsors: Irish Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, Africana Studies, Falvey Library, the Honors Program, Villanova Writing Center, and Modern Language and Literature. Again, thank you guys for coming. We'll see you next year. We'll turn it over to Dan and Phil.
Mr. Haskell made it very difficult for me to come up with a biography about him. On his website, there's a link that says biography in 1,000 words, but that's just a picture of his face. Great cover. The basics are on the back of his book, however, that he was a former actor, playwright, and performance artist who has worked in Chicago and New York. And in an interview I found online with Charles Haskell, no relation, I found out that after college he took a job at a Hollywood answering service and took a playwriting class. He then moved to Chicago and worked for David Mamet, ushering at his theater. And he then met some people there through the Art Institute, and they started a little theater company. He wrote some plays, some of which he won awards for, and he wrote a few monologues, and they became the start of I Am Not Jackson Pollock, which is his first book, a book of short stories. He then moved back to New York after about 7 years and continued writing monologues while working different jobs. There he met a woman who was also a writer and who had an agent, and that agent read his work, who then sold I Am Not Jackson Pollock. And Mr. Haskell says that is how it all got started. He has written 2 novels along with his short stories. They are American Purgatorio and Out of My Skin. He has a quote that I like, and it's in response to what he likes to write. He says, "When I start a project, if something doesn't grab me, it's not necessary to write it. If a certain feeling or emotion doesn't grab me, I don't have to write it."
I Am Not Jackson Pollock is an engaging collection of inventive prose that takes pop culture icons, historical figures, movie characters, actors, mythological figures, and even animals, and delves into their minds, focusing on the desires that drive and in some cases confine them. Often reading more like essays or character sketches than stories, these short pieces are both challenging and accessible. Haskell's language is conversational and clear, yet it points to complexities deep below the surface conflicts of these characters. It is difficult to concisely do justice to the many characters and conflicts in this book. The figures here, from Anthony Perkins playing Norman Bates in Psycho to Laika, the first dog in space, are all battling their desires and struggling with conflicts of communication and identity. The reader begins to wonder, at what point does one's persona become an entity separate from the identity? At what point does the actor become the character? Are we supposed to act on desires or suppress them? The themes are complex, but that is the point. John Haskell does not make conclusions. He raises questions about society, its constructs, and its limitations. The figures in this collection, even the animals, embody the human condition and the struggles from which we may never truly escape, but can learn to understand. Jim Crace says of I Am Not Jackson Pollock, "Here is a book that defies the usual categories, but one thing's for sure, I savored every mythic, mesmerizing word of it." It's an honor and a privilege to welcome John Haskell to Villanova.
Thanks. Well, thanks. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. Thanks to Alan and Lisa for inviting me here. That was nice. I guess the day could have been better. So the class that I met with today, it looks like it's about half the people here, and we talked a lot about the book Jackson Pollock, which you heard about, and I read a little bit in the class. So I was thinking I wouldn't read from that because they heard me read, and anyone else doesn't know it anyway. Doesn't know that I'm not going to read it. So I'm going to read from. I think I'll read from the beginning of the two other novels. And it's always nice to have an arc, like kind of a story that I tell. But this will be more like just a taste, like a tasting menu or something, to give you a taste of other things I wrote. Is that okay? Okay, good. 'Cause that's what I'm going to do. Let's see. I feel there's something else I ought to do. Like a something, but I won't do it. I'll just start. Except I will say, so this is from the book, the next book, which is a novel, and I'll just read the first chapter, the first little section. But I will say this, just because I think I should, is that it's, I told the class this, it's divided up into 7 sections based on the 7 deadly sins. I don't know if Villanova is probably not now, but it might have been a religious school in the beginning. Does anybody know? Yeah, I see a cross up there. It made me think about it. So each chapter is one of the 7 deadly sins, and this chapter is called Suburbia. Anybody know what that is? Pride. But I'll explain that later. So here's the beginning of this. I'm from Chicago originally. I went to New York, married a girl named Anne, and was in the middle of living happily ever after when something happened. I didn't know what it was, and if you would have asked me at the time, I would have said nothing, that nothing was happening, because for me, nothing was. I was standing in a convenience store next to a gas station along a picturesque parkway in New Jersey. I was perusing the assorted candies and snacks, debating with myself what to bring back to Anne. She was waiting in the car. We were driving to her mother's house, and I was probably reading the labels, looking for something nutritious to eat. Although it wasn't a dream, the unnatural light of the convenience store made it seem as if I was existing in the world of a dream. The main difference being that, unlike a dream world, in this world, the convenience store world, nothing much was happening. That's not right. It was all happening. I just wasn't seeing it. I wasn't seeing it because my attention was absorbed by the walls of refrigerated cases and the aisles of bright displays. I was concentrating on all the possible choices, which, after a while, I narrowed down to a thin pack of peanuts, a protein-style candy bar, and a so-called energy drink. When I paid the cashier, I didn't notice the rings on the woman's fingers, and I didn't count my change. When I walked to the door, I didn't notice the grease stains on the square brown tiles or the sky, which was blue through the window. When I walked outside, back to the car, all I noticed was that the car was gone. This is the story of a man who, I won't say I was never stuck, but I was good at making adjustments. That was my specialty, adjusting to circumstances. I prided myself on this ability, and so the first thing I did was convince myself that nothing had happened, that Anne would suddenly appear. And when she didn't appear, I began looking for her. I mean, she had to be somewhere in some part of this service station area, and because there were only a limited number of places she could be, I started looking in those places. I expected to see her either waiting for gas or putting air in the tires or parked in the small lot behind the store. Although I didn't actually see her in any of the places she ought to be, I knew she was there in one of them, and that in my mind I was making a mistake, that fatigue or oversight or an optical illusion was keeping me from seeing what must be right in front of me. According to our plan, Anne would be filling the car with gas and I would be buying some treats for the road for our journey to Nyack, north of New York City. New York City was where we lived, in a house in Brooklyn, and we were driving to Anne's mother's house, and now she was parking the car, or had parked it, and was waiting for me in the parking area behind the store. Except she wasn't there. The service station compound was not that big, and as I walked the length of it, took an inventory of every car, I could see that our car, our little maroon station wagon, well, it wasn't getting gas, and it wasn't getting air, and it wasn't waiting in the parking area. Something was happening. I wanted nothing to be happening. I wanted not to be nervous and worried, and although I was worried, I tried to keep that worry safely below consciousness, which wasn't easy. To keep it there, I had to assume certain things. I had to assume that Anne was having trouble with the car and had needed to keep the engine running, that she'd gone ahead and would soon be returning. Although this didn't make much sense, I was willing to believe it. In fact, I was eager to believe it, because if it wasn't that, then it was some alternative, and I didn't want to think too hard about any alternative because I wanted her back. I wanted the car to be where it ought to be, and I just overlooked it. There it is, I wanted to say. No problem, I wanted to say, but it wasn't the case. The car was gone, and so was Anne. Now, I could tell I was upset because my heart was pounding against my chest. For me, that's always an indication. Also, there was the fact that I was cursing her, and at the same time praying for her safety. I mean, she wouldn't just leave like that or have forgotten me. That would be impossible. And yet, if I let myself think about what might have happened, but I didn't do that. Well, I should say I didn't want to do that because how could I not? I mean, how could I not imagine that some man with a gun or a knife had approached her and forced himself into the car, forced her to drive to some remote area off the road, some trees and a picnic table, and to lie on this picnic table, and she was wearing jeans, I could picture them, and her running shoes. And so the pounding of my heart was fear. I loved her, and I was afraid. And yet at the same time, if she was taking a little side trip to buy some film or some sushi or something, and she's not raped, but safe and happy, although I wanted her to be safe and happy, I would be angry. And I was going to be angry, but at the moment I was confused, partly because I loved her, and partly because I didn't want to be feeling the thing I was feeling. Since I'd left my cell phone in the car, I used a payphone by the air supply to call first her cell phone, then mine, but either they weren't turned on or they weren't working. So I waited. I sat on the perimeter of the gas station, literally on the edge of a galvanized metal railing, watching the procession of cars pulling up and the attendants in their blue uniforms. There was never really a lull in the stream of cars, but during a relative lull, I walked to one of the attendants and I asked him if he'd seen a maroon-colored station wagon. But the man naturally couldn't remember any one specific car, and not only that, he didn't speak much English. But he wanted to be helpful, so he called over a colleague who, although he seemed more in charge, spoke even less English, which was my language. And because I thought I knew a little Spanish, I tried to speak about un carro con una señorita. Buscando por la señorita, I said. And the second man, who according to his shirt was named Ramon, after consulting with the other attendants and after some gesturing, all the time monitoring the gas pumps, made it clear that something bad had happened, something muy malo. And although I didn't want to hear about anything muy malo, I said, ¿Qué pasa?, which means roughly, what is happening? Not because I couldn't feel what was happening to me, but because it was the only way I knew to ask what had happened to my wife. Oh, something had happened. That much I could translate. Couldn't be sure what it was or how it happened or who it happened to, only that it seemed to involve several people and a couple of cars. I believe the men were probably telling the truth, but it wasn't my truth, and certainly not a truth about Anne. They were describing some other situation. I mean, there were millions of women in the world, and as the attendants were indicating the height of this specific señorita and saying that moreno, which means brown, was the color of her hair, it was clear they were saying that this woman was gone, nada más, which means no more, but no more of what? I didn't know. I was saying to them and to myself, no problema, no problema. But the men were shaking their heads as if there was a problema, a gran problema. And I was backing away, thanking them and nodding, trusting that the whole communication process was impeded by either the excitement of the retelling or the impatient honking of cars waiting for gas or the language barrier. Somehow in the gap between us, the message had been scrambled and I was getting the whole thing wrong. All I could think to do was wait. Oh, Anne could be impulsive, and the waiting itself was an attempt to preserve the illusion that nothing substantial had happened. I sat on the metal guardrail, trying to find the padding in my buttocks, watching the cars, one after the other, car after car, and by now it was afternoon. It wasn't afternoon before, but now it was, which meant I'd been waiting a long time, and all during that whole time I was still expecting Anne to pull up any minute, waving and smiling and ready to go. I drank my drink, ate the peanuts and the candy bar, and tried to adjust. I tried to banish the unpleasant thoughts I was having, and I did to some extent. I noticed the trees, for instance, and the slow sway of their branches. I tried to fill my mind with the small moments that together comprised what I thought of as beauty. The clouds and the darkening sky and the cool breeze. And I was able to find in this way a modicum of that beauty. A little modicum, if that's even possible. But it wasn't enough to dull my agitation. And because I was still agitated, I decided to take action. Action begins with intention. Intention leads to decision. And as the sun sank lower into the sky, I decided it was getting late, and I called Anne's mother. No answer. And I called our house. Again, no answer. I called Anne's cell phone one more time, and then decided to go home, saving my reaction to what was happening for later. Okay, that's the first chapter. So it kind of sets up what's going to happen, obviously. Well, not obviously, right? But he goes on, this character then kind of goes on a cross-country search to find his wife. And also, yes, more things happen too. But you have to read that if you're interested. Who here of the students at least, let's see, how can I phrase this? Who likes stories better than novels? Oh, everybody likes novels better. Who likes wait, here's a trick question. Who likes novels better than stories? No, a few hands did go up. Oh, novels better than stories, okay. I thought no one wanted to raise their hand for anything. Okay, I need some water now. Okay, so then I thought I would read the first, I'm having trouble with my S's, the first chapter of this next book. That was called American Purgatorio, and this is called Out of My Skin. And if there's time, I could even read, for the people who weren't in the class, I could read a little part of but whatever, we'll see how it goes. So this, again, it's the very beginning of the book, so it doesn't need much introduction. It's a little bit different in tone, I think, but you guys can decide that. Okay, ready? You're very quiet, you notice that? Yeah, very quiet. Okay. I'll try to be quiet too. I'll read a little more quietly, more subdued. That was kind of emotional, right? What happened to me? Not me, but what happened. I'm from New York originally, and I moved to Los Angeles to write about movies. Now, instead of writing about movies or people making movies, I was somewhere off the California coast, in the middle of the ocean, writing an article about sharks. A group of scientists had rigged up a fishing boat with winches and scientific instruments, and they'd lowered a stainless steel cage into the water. They were investigating shark communication. Because I was writing an article about their investigation, I was inside the cage. I was under the water, wearing a wetsuit, and under the wetsuit there were sensors attached to various parts of my body, measuring my heart rate and brain activity. And partly I was thinking about brain activity, but mainly I was thinking about sharks. They'd pretty much guaranteed me a shark attack, something about an anomaly in the ocean current. So I stood there, or I should say I floated there, my back to the boat's hull, holding the steel handrail, listening to the air as it passed from the scuba gear into my lungs. That, plus the pressure of the water, plus the temperature of the water, plus the fact that there was going to be a shark attack, was focusing my attention. Speckled sunlight was filtering down from the surface of the water. Schools of little fish were darting out from the darkness. I noticed pieces of meat floating above the cage. The scientists were chumming for sharks, and the blood from the meat was dissolving into the water. Through the mask on my face, I was scanning the water, looking for a shark, knowing the minute I stopped looking, the minute I took my mind off the idea of shark, like a watched pot, that's when a shark would appear. And because I didn't want to miss that appearance, I kept my mind focused on the darkness in front of me, not thinking about anything other than the barely visible darkness. But I must have been thinking something, and I must have been in the middle of thinking it when a white underbelly flashed by, huge and white and slightly above me. Suddenly, the bait was gone. The bait was gone, and the shark was gone, but I was still there. And I didn't know what the scientists, looking at the data from my sensors, were recording, but it was probably fear. My heart was pounding, and my adrenaline was pumping, and I could feel my fingertips pulsing inside my rubber gloves. I'd seen enough of the shark to feel its threat, but because I was protected by the safety of the cage, what would normally seem like fear felt to me like the opposite of fear. No, not desire exactly, because I couldn't actually see the shark, but I was aware of something just beyond my vision. When I say aware, I mean I was sensing from the shark a kind of communication. And since the most rudimentary form of communication is the expression of desire, I was sensing the shark's desire. And since one of the things it was desiring was my annihilation, well, I can't say there wasn't a certain amount of fear, but what I was trying to do was reach out through that fear and communicate with this thing. The human brain is capable of receiving millions of neural signals, and I was trying from inside the cage to send signals to the shark. I wanted to tell the shark that I understood what it wanted, and I accepted what it wanted. And I was just beginning to experience the freedom of this interspecies conversation when I felt the cage begin to rise. The scientists were bringing me up out of the water, and I didn't want to come out, not quite yet. And I tried to tell them, I tried to signal through the sensors in my body that I wasn't ready, that I was still conducting the experiment. I tried to think those thoughts and send those thoughts, but maybe the sensors weren't working. Or maybe my thoughts weren't working. Either way, I felt the weight of the water pushing me down as the cage rose up like an elevator, and there I was again, in the breathable normalcy of air. The cage was set down on its special platform. Say that again. The cage was set down on its special platform, and when the door was open, I remember ducking through the opening and stumbling out onto the relative stability of the deck. Although I was standing on the deck, I was still experiencing what had happened a few moments earlier. I felt almost weightless, like air, only lighter than air. My head like a balloon floating on the top of my spine. I could feel my lungs expanding, and I could hear voices talking and metal clinking against metal. People were standing in front of me, and as I stepped out of the cage, I embraced first the captain, who extended a hand, and then an assistant scientist who brought me a mug of tea. No more than embrace her, I locked my arms around her waterproof jacket. She wore overalls and rubber boots, and I could hear her asking if I was all right. I don't remember what I said exactly, but I must have been grinning. And it must have been an infectious grin, because when she led me to a plastic crate, she was grinning at me. And I sat there, still in the wetsuit, the electronic wafers still taped to my body, a blue blanket around my neck, my butt bones on the plastic crate, my feet on the deck, and the ocean in front of me, the sky above me, and the only thing missing was my thought. I noticed a corroded hinge on the cabin door. And instead of thinking about what kind of paint they used to paint the hinge, or imagining how I would paint the hinge if I owned the boat, instead of reacting to the hinge, I just saw what it was. Every so often I noticed a thought slip into my head, but it was easy enough to let it go and return my attention to the hinge, or the assistant scientist. Her long hair was falling across her wide blue eyes. She was standing in front of a portable control panel, asking me questions, measuring my physiological responses, telling me that although she hadn't done it yet, she wanted to go under the water herself. She told me her name was Elena, that she was an intern, and we talked about Dramamine and UCLA and the life of a marine biologist. There I was, holding my mug of warm tea, looking at her face and the peaceful horizon behind her face, and I wouldn't have called it paradise exactly, but if paradise is a place where the need for protection falls away, then that's where I was. And the only question is, how long does it last? I was drinking my tea, tasting the tea and the sugar in the tea, and seeing this person in front of me, her teeth when she smiled, and the gums above her teeth, and her lips. The shape of her lips reminded me of a certain movie star, and I began thinking about the various roles I'd seen that particular movie star play. And while I was thinking, and while I was involved in the various narratives that led from that thinking, I wasn't actually seeing the wide blue eyes of the assistant scientist. It wasn't that I wasn't paying attention, I didn't even know I wasn't paying attention. I was sitting there in the middle of what might have been a normal conversation, and I was creating not a cage exactly, but a sense of who I was. That's the first chapter of that book. Which one are you going to buy? No, you don't have to buy any. I think, so that's probably enough reading. It's all going to sound the same if I read it anymore. Now the problem is, the first class asked me questions, but does anyone else have, questions are hard in a group. How can we get started? Does anyone have a question? See, that's always, brilliant.
For being in the shark cage, did you actually go to the shark cage? Have you ever been in one?
No, I don't know. When I grew up, though, there was once a man named Jacques Cousteau. I don't know if you know, but they used to have all those shows where they'd, and I don't know, I'd sit around, that was before the internet, so I'd watch TV all the time, and so that was one of the things they did is, big game hunting in Africa or something like that, or some guy would go into a cage and do that. So no, I've never even been, I've been snorkeling, but never scuba diving even. So yeah, you have to, I just imagined it. But yeah. And they say, I don't know if it's true, that sometimes writers don't write about what they did, they imagine what they didn't do, or they write about what they didn't do because that's what they didn't do and they want to live that or know about it or something. Okay, now the ball's rolling. Question here. Red? Oh no, right behind, yeah.
Oh, okay, still me, sorry.
Whoever, I just pointed generally.
How, 'cause I know I am not Jackson Pollock, there's a lot of third person. And it seems in your novels it's more first person. So I was wondering if it's immediately clear to you whether a character's going to be told from like the first person to third person, or if you have to play around with it to find the right place.
Good question. Well, in the Purgatorio, I actually had that as a third person for a long time, and it was pretty far along, almost finished. And then I thought, it's really, it needed something. Sometimes a first person, it's odd too because, well, the first person can be more immediate because it's right there. It's certainly more immediate when you write because, well, it doesn't even have to be. Although, if you're writing about, if I was going to write about this person on the end here, going, she went and sat in the chair. But if I had to be the eyes of that person, then you see, I went and sat by the chair and I passed the wood frame and the painting rattled. You really have to imagine it more. it's tricky though because it can be used as a crutch too, like a present tense. You can say, I walked to the store and I see the guy. Well, it seems really to say he walked to the store and he saw the guy. It's a little more distance. So you have to just kind of play with it. It can be easier to be more what's the word, immediate if you're first person present tense, but it's also kind of maybe it's too easy and it's not as worked on. So you just have to kind of play with it. But it's a good. I did think about that. In the Out of My Skin, I did it all. I'm kind of getting more first person-y, so maybe I should change that. I don't want to get into a rut. Question? No, I think you have a question. No? Okay. Up.
So you were a screenwriter before. I was wondering, a playwright. Have you ever written any plays since you started being published? It seems like you've only been producing first the short stories and then the novels. And if you haven't or have, which do you prefer out of all the different I guess, genres or different styles?
Yeah, I think about that sometimes because, because I wanted to be a playwright. So I went to Chicago as one of my intro, I can't remember his name, but said. And I wanted to be a playwright. I mean, I was an actor too, but I wasn't really a serious actor. I was mainly a playwright. And sometimes I'd sit down at a typewriter and just write whatever, just like write for hours. Sometimes just whatever kind of came in my head, maybe dialogue with myself and anything. So I liked that form, and I did write plays. And as I told your class, it was sort of a play, at the beginning of a play that led to writing stories. Am I moving around too much? That's okay. Play. So you'd think I'd go back, but it's almost. It's strange. I would like to, but I feel so far away from that and what people are doing and how you talk about ideas in a play. It seems so far away now. It would be very hard to go back. I think, and also the plays I like are more not multimedia, I'll say. They're not like two people sitting and just talking. It's maybe other things going on. Kind of like Jackson Pollock, there might be another thing. It's just more complicated. And it would just require so much, like turning my brain to whole other things. So I think I'm on a little, that was one path and it kind of went off in that direction. Now I'm on this path. I could get to it, but I'd have to cross this field of weeds to get there, and I'm fine here. So I think but I do think about it because plays are great, and I also like to read like plays when they have short lines. You read that, it goes fast. You can read right down a page, turn the page, read things. It's fun. I did write just because. Well, the class that I was in knows that I will just talk about anything. But I did write a screenplay one time, and that was a huge flop for me and for everything. Because like writing novels, writing the plays, you can just, and this is the beauty of kind of writing fiction, I guess, is that you can do what you want. I mean, no one's telling me, oh, write about this, write this way. I don't get paid enough for anyone to really care that much. So I can do really whatever I want. When I wrote the movie, I was always figuring out, let's see, what has to happen in a movie on page. And I don't know if you know about screenwriting, but certain events have to happen, the plot has to move in a certain way, and I was always worried, am I doing this? That I didn't even know what I was doing. It meant nothing to me. So I find this easier. Okay, let's do one more question.
Coming from being an actor and then writing for the stage and then moving to the page, how has that influenced your style in writing, from going from spoken word to words on a page?
You were not at the class. That's good. But that's a good question. Well, I don't know. Could you tell from my reading that it has a certain I never know if this is the right word, orality. I don't think that's the right word. But it has a, I like to play with rhythm and how speech happens and how people, not to replicate how people speak, but how people speak, and then maybe they say something really fast and then it slows down a little bit or something like that. So I like to play with the rhythms and the sounds of the text, and that comes from theater because when I was learning, I was just trying to, how do people talk and how does that happen? And the sound of the, I always liked, well, there was Mamet, who I did go to Chicago for. I always liked Harold Pinter too, but all those people are fun to listen to. They're just fun. Like to hear their words are just fun. Sometimes to hear them, if I knew something, I'd do it now for you because it'd be in a British accent. I won't do it. I can't do it. But it's just fun to listen to the words sometimes. And that's what I got from the playwriting. Okay. I said one more, but I'll even take another. Oop, don't move your hand around here. Ah, yes.
As a former Los Angeles resident, I was conscious when I was reading out of my skin of the Los Angeles-ness of the novel, and I was wondering if, as someone writing in and about LA, you felt at all the sort of weight of the tradition of LA writing about the city.
Ah. Well, there is a big tradition. And I was talking earlier, you know, Raymond Chandler. I like Raymond Chandler. I think I read some John Fante when I was out because I think I was living in his area. But somehow I didn't feel like that. As people in the class, there are pictures in Jackson Pollock. I actually went around each chapter. You can't really see them. But the beginning of each chapter has a little picture, and they're kind of random. I always felt the LA that I was kind of interested in not that it was seedy, because Chandler liked the seedy, John Fante liked the seedy, Joan Didion wrote about seediness. I mean, it's kind of a seedy city, but it's also a non-existent place. It's just like stores and traffic lights, and it almost could be anywhere. I like that. Even though it was LA and I thought about specific places for each where the scenes took place, it was just my place too. I didn't feel that there was, I didn't feel the weight of anybody come before. I could have, that would have slowed me down, but no, I didn't. Okay, that's it. Thank you for coming.